I'd like to talk about or follow up on a theme of collaborative energy and maybe talk about it from a producer's perspective. And maybe I'll give a little bit of history of Northern Cross. We've been a producer for many years, but we've over the years worked in an area that's a bit of an island. In other words, we're in the northern part of Huron County, where you're separated from the main natural gas infrastructure, the Dawn Hub that we heard about. We're further away from that, and so we've had to, by design, become fully integrated in the gas business. In other words, in order to produce gas, we had to build our own pipelines, get our own customers, and process gas. So we live in we're a small company, but fully integrated and have somewhat a unique approach. But because of that idea of full integration, the access that we've had in that area to infrastructure has generally been with the electric power system. There's a very strong electric power grid going through the heart of Huron County, whereas you have a relatively weak natural gas grid. So we've taken advantage of that, and we can maybe talk a little bit about the collaborative energy between natural gas and renewable energy and now energy storage. So just to start off, that's an agricultural processing facility that we've been supplying with gas for about 30 years. This is a way of taking local resources and finding a way to market them and stay in business in an area where there's no natural gas infrastructure. So the area where I want to talk about is the area north of Goderich, and it's in the eastern part of the Michigan Basin in a Pinnacle Reef belt, and so this is the area we're talking about. Significant in this area is we're a long way from the Dawn Hub and the main part of the natural gas infrastructure in Ontario. But we are in an area that's just south of the Bruce nuclear power station, and so there's a 500 kV main transmission line that goes through the heart of the area where we operate. So access to very large capacity electric power infrastructure, but no access to large natural gas infrastructure. So what I want to talk about is some of the existing facilities that we've developed over about 30 years, and look at how we became integrated with the electric power system, and then eventually look at how we can become integrated in the energy storage business. So one of the first things we did was build a gas-fired cogeneration facility, so high efficiency gas-fired generation. Then we became involved in renewable power project development, and as that developed into very large wind power infrastructure, we became aware of the need for energy storage, because this was intermittent power, and we've heard about that from other speakers. So our response to that was we started a company called Next Hydrogen to build grid-scale, multi-megawatt water electrolyzers. And so this is a different approach to energy storage from what we heard about with compressed air energy storage. I want to talk a little bit about underground hydrogen storage, also the idea of power to gas, in other words, mixing hydrogen with natural gas. And I'll talk a little bit about compressed air energy storage. We already heard about that, so I think I'll probably go light on that. But one of the things I'd like to discuss is the idea of compressed air energy storage in porous reservoirs as opposed to salt caverns. So just a quick bit of background. I've already given some of it, but we've been in business for about 30 years. As I mentioned, we're a very small company, but we happen to be fully integrated really by necessity. So we own and operate facilities right from the reservoir to the burner tip, and actually through our cogeneration facility right through to the electric power grid. We operate 5 producing Pinnacle Reefs in Huron County. We have about 55 kilometers of gas lines. 3 of the producing pools are suitable for gas storage, with about 7 BCF of working gas storage capacity. Interestingly, in this area, These reefs have not been developed, even though they're approaching depletion, have not been developed for natural gas storage. Well, why not? Well, because we're distant from the main, the larger capacity natural gas pipelines. So even though these are pinnacle reefs suitable for gas storage, they haven't been. And because of that distance from the main infrastructure, they're not likely to be. So, I want to look at the use of these pinnacle reefs that are not used for gas storage for other forms of energy storage. And I think this is important for other producers to look at, opportunities to monetize and integrate your production pools with the electric power grid as opposed to the natural gas grid. So one way to store energy is as a gas, whether it be compressed air or in this case, I want to talk about hydrogen. So if you're going to store energy underground and as a gas, is that gas air or is it hydrogen? So this will just show you the area where we operate in a little more detail. So Goderich is down here in the bottom left corner, and so the area north of there. Again, this is part of the Pinnacle Reef belt in the eastern part of the Michigan Basin, and we operate 5 pools: Ashfield, Fitzgerald, Duncannon, St. Helens, and Fordyce is up here. We're interconnected with the Union system over here, so we can both take gas off the Union system and put gas back on the Union system. So it's a two-way metering facility, and we switch depending on the time of year. We do have an end-use customer on our system, which I showed a picture of earlier. What's also interesting is this is the eastern part of Lake Huron. And so there's very large-scale wind power development in that area. So there's, we're in a very much a very large development area for wind power. And this is an example of how we can integrate, because Northern Cross was very much involved in the development of wind power in that area. So we're very familiar with intermittent power and renewable energy. So just I'll go through this fairly quickly, but we built a cogen in 1992, and that was really as a sales outlet for our gas, because I mentioned we were islanded. We didn't have other sales outlets, so we thought, well, we've got access to the power grid. We'll take our gas, convert it to electric power, and put it on the grid as a way of marketing our gas. So that cogen was one of the first built of its kind in Ontario. It has waste heat recovery, being a cogen, and we gained some insight from building that into how to interface with the electric power grid as opposed to interfacing with the natural gas grid. So that's a picture of the cogen, and it's at the Thompson's. It's an agricultural processing facility. So subsequent to that, it became clear to us that there was a growing demand for renewable energy, and so we formed an affiliate, Port Albert Wind Farms, and we built what I believe was the first commercial wind turbine in Ontario. In other words, not publicly funded. And so that unit came on stream in 2001 and has been producing for 17 years. So we have some history in the wind power business. That company was sold to EPCOR in 2005, and the project portfolio that we developed is now a project of about 300 megawatts. So it's a very large wind development, and actually I believe it's the largest wind farm in Canada. But one thing we found from our experience with the wind business is exactly what we've been hearing about earlier, is that this is not dispatchable power. In other words, it just shows up. The wind's blowing, the sun's shining, you're getting power whether you need it or not. And initially, people's response to intermittent power was to say, "Oh, gee, if the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, we better build gas-fired generation to back it up." And that's true. You do need to have that backup. But sometimes the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, and you wind up with very significant surpluses of power. And we heard about that a bit earlier. But what do you do with it? And initially the answer was, well, we're going to dump it, into adjoining utilities in Quebec and Ontario, in the U.S. But in many cases, there's no home for it. I mean, there's you have to give it away or sell it for very low prices. You can also curtail it, and so there is quite a bit of curtailment of power. But when you curtail a wind farm, you're wasting that power. It's worth less than nothing, because not only do you waste it and get no value for it, but there's a cost of mechanically shutting down a piece of equipment and starting it back up again. So you do have significant amounts of power that are wasted. So we started a company, after we sold Port Albert Wind Farms, called Next Hydrogen, and our objective has been, and we're sort of there now, is developing very large grid-scale water electrolyzers. So this is a different take on use of surplus energy to produce a commodity, which is hydrogen. And so there's a very large global demand for hydrogen now. So you can create a value-added product. So this is a little different from compressed air energy storage, where you do a round trip. You take power off the grid, you put it back on. In this case, you can take surplus power off the grid and create a green source of hydrogen. I'll go through this fairly quickly, but that was what I believe was the first commercial wind turbine in Ontario. So that's 2001. This shows a bit of the integration that I was talking about of facilities. So that's a solar project that we built. In the background is the wind power development that we put together in Port Albert Wind Farms. But interestingly, the wind turbine on the left, and the one shown in the previous picture, is sitting right on top of the Ashfield gas pool. And that's not an accident. We had long-standing relationships with farmers there, where we paid them royalties and developed gas together. And so when it came to, and they were interested and supportive of us building a gas-fired cogen. And then we started doing wind resource assessments, and there was a lot of collaboration with landowners there who were very interested in seeing these things develop. And so when we we're looking at building a wind turbine, there was a lot of support. They said, hey, why don't you build it right here, and it turned out that not only did it interface with the same system that our cogen was connected to, but also, we could work with the same farmers and sort of integrate this whole thing. So wind and solar development are now common in that area. Very large wind development, quite a bit of solar development in that fairway along the eastern shore of Lake Huron. There's more than 1,000 megawatts of intermittent power. It's not dispatchable, so you get it whether you want it or not, unless you physically turn off the wind turbines. So there are periodic surpluses, and we've heard about that. So there's the need for energy storage. I won't get into a great deal of detail on this, but this graph here, the green graph, and you can't see the units, and it doesn't really matter. But we did with Next Hydrogen a very detailed review of the Ontario power grid now and in the future to look at the amount of energy that would be surplus. So what you see in red is the amount of surplus power, and then the blue lower graph is the amount of energy that would be curtailed. So these surpluses that we're talking about are in the order of 10,000 gigawatt hours per year, and that's an enormous amount of energy that would otherwise be wasted, or if it's curtailed, it's basically wasted. And so you want to look at ways to store that. So this is the energy storage world. We saw a different take on it in a previous presentation, but what we're interested in is the upper right, where these are large amounts of energy for long periods of time. So flywheels and batteries, can be smaller amounts of energy for shorter periods of time. But when you're looking at large amounts of energy for longer periods of time, in other words, days, weeks, months, and huge quantities of energy, then there's a few options up here: compressed air, pumped hydro. But this sphere in here, which is even larger amounts of energy, and longer periods of time is hydrogen and synthetic natural gas. So surplus power can be converted into a gas. I mean, I guess I'm simplifying it, but it's either air or hydrogen. And the best way to store that in large quantities is underground. And again, we heard that earlier. So the two differences really, I think, are compressed air is a round trip. You take power off the system, you put it back on the system, but the medium is air, which in itself doesn't have any commodity value. I mean, you can't sell air. So you use it as a medium. Our interest as a producer is the use of porous reservoirs. In other words, we have pinnacle reefs. They are depleted, and if you don't use them for storing natural gas, can you use them for storing hydrogen or use them for storing air? And we know that there's quite a bit of work going on, and I won't get into details on that, on use of porous media instead of salt caverns for storing air. And there's going to be testing and new regs required before you do that. But that's an opportunity that we can investigate for depleted natural gas pools and repurposing them rather than natural gas storage for air storage. This is a schematic of a compressed air system. We saw one earlier, and maybe rather than talk about compressed air, which Eric's done a good job talking about already, I won't get into that. Maybe I will talk about hydrogen, which is a bit more up our alley. So we can convert surplus power into hydrogen using electrolyzers, which is they're called water electrolyzers, where you take water and basically separate it into oxygen and hydrogen using electric power. So we've been developing those over the last number of years and now have commercial units that are in multi-megawatt scale to do that. But one of the things that we wanted to do, which hadn't been done in the past with large-scale water electrolyzers, is have what's called dynamic response. In other words, they're not designed to run 24/7. You can respond to changes in surplus power and make hydrogen when there's surplus power and stop making hydrogen when the power is needed for something else. There are very large hydrogen facilities and industries all over the world, including very large ones in Ontario, mostly in the Sarnia area. The refineries and petrochemical plants use a lot of hydrogen. But interestingly, about 98% of the world's hydrogen is made from fossil fuels. So you take fossil fuels, you take out the carbon to recover the hydrogen, but what you're left with is carbon. So in separating those from fossil fuels, you get the hydrogen, but your waste product is carbon, which generally goes up the stack, and these are very large sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So electrolytic hydrogen can be emission-free. So if you want to reduce the carbon intensity of refineries and petrochemical plants and the products that they produce, then using electrolytic hydrogen made from surplus renewable energy can give you a zero-emission hydrogen source. So in this case, you're using peak energy to produce a valuable commodity, which is green hydrogen. And there's a growing demand for hydrogen in general, but even more so for new sources. So fuel cell vehicles. There's an organization called the Hydrogen Council, which is a global organization of some of the world's largest companies that have presented a view of moving to a hydrogen economy. And I remember when I was a young engineer, one of our textbooks was the principles of a hydrogen economy. And so I think we'll probably hear a lot more about that as time goes by in terms of the use of hydrogen to power the whole economy. Vehicles, electric power, you could power pretty well everything with hydrogen. So this is the concept that I talked about with wind or solar energy, running it through an electrolyzer, in this case next hydrogen, storing it underground, to balance it so you can just use off-peak power and underground hydrogen storage. And then you've got applications for using hydrogen in transportation, refineries, and actually the largest use of hydrogen in the world is for making ammonia for fertilizer. So this is what a very large-scale electrolyzer looks like. So that was developed by Next Hydrogen, and an idea of the unique cell architecture that we came up with. We've now produced 2 of those commercially, and our first commercial customer is Canadian Tire. Canadian Tire, incidentally, uses them for their forklifts, where they have very large distribution centers with into the hundreds of forklifts that run 24/7. They, by necessity, are zero emission. They operate indoors. And so they've switched them, interestingly, from batteries to fuel cells. And so we can use off-peak power to make hydrogen and run these forklifts. But the same system can be used with transport trucks, delivery trucks, buses. And so we're working with quite a few companies that are doing that. So, growing demand for zero-emission vehicles. One of the best ways you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to displace diesel with green hydrogen. So we are delivering these units. But interestingly, and this leads me to underground storage, you can mix hydrogen with natural gas. And there's a concept that many big companies are involved with, including Enriched, of what they call power to gas, where you take power off system, convert it to electrolytically to hydrogen, and then put it back into the gas system. So a mixture of natural gas and hydrogen. And so in a conventional natural gas system, you can have up to about 10% of hydrogen without having to change the facilities. So that is a bit of a round trip where you take power off system, make hydrogen. Instead of putting it back onto the grid, you put it back into a natural gas system. But another way to look at that is and this is where the underground storage comes into it, and Ontario producers and using some of these reservoirs is you can inject hydrogen into natural gas reservoirs. As I said, you can put it into a pipeline up to 10%. You don't have a similar restriction in storing it underground. And so you can store very large amounts of hydrogen underground. And it could be in a salt cavern, but it could also be in a natural gas reservoir where you're going to wind up with a mixture of hydrogen and natural gas. So that mixture of hydrogen and natural gas, the terms coined as HENG, hydrogen enriched natural gas. So what do you do with hydrogen enriched natural gas? It can be in a pipeline or it can be underground, and One way to look at this, and an opportunity that we're looking at in terms of hydrogen-enriched natural gas, is again, this is the area that I talked about earlier, north of Goderich. Sorry, this is our existing system, but north of there, in the southern part of Bruce, there is no gas service now, and there's been a number of hearings with the OEB to determine who's going to build the infrastructure, but there will be new infrastructure built in this area. And so we're looking at underground storage of both natural gas and hydrogen. So coming up with hydrogen-enriched natural gas, which what we would like to do, what we would propose to do, is to interconnect that with this new distribution system and give them a source of natural gas that is two things. One is it's produced locally, it's stored locally, and it uses locally produced renewable energy to produce hydrogen enriched natural gas, which is a low carbon, greener form of energy. So this is a way we can integrate our gas production with energy storage, with the gas system. So it's a reduced carbon alternative. It can be produced from pipelines. So let's look at the interface of hydrogen-enriched natural gas and underground storage. I think our objective in storing hydrogen is eventually to be able to be a source of pure hydrogen, so that you can deliver it to refineries, petrochemical plants, and have a zero-emission hydrogen source to provide to petrochemical plants, which right now are very large sources of greenhouse gases. And so they all have a desire to reduce their carbon intensity, their carbon footprint, and this is a way to do it. So the interface of the power grid, renewable energy, electrolytic hydrogen, and then end use of hydrogen. In storing hydrogen underground, if you use a depleted pool, which in our case we operate 5 pools, 3 of them are likely candidates for storage. We're not on the grid where we could use it for conventional natural gas storage. But if we are in an area where there's a huge amount of renewable energy, and so if we take that off the grid, run it through an electrolyzer, produce green hydrogen, store it underground, it's going to mix with the remaining natural gas that's in those reservoirs. Now, so you've got that mixture. You could put it back into a pipeline system and keep it below that 10% threshold and use it conventionally. But that's a bit of a waste of pure green hydrogen, which really has a higher value than what natural gas would have. So the goal is to keep increasing the concentration of hydrogen in these natural gas reservoirs. So when they're depleted, you've got relatively small amount of natural gas left, and so you inject more and more hydrogen, and as you withdraw it, you're not injecting any more natural gas. You're just injecting hydrogen. So the concentration goes up and up and up. So you get a much higher concentration of hydrogen. Once that gets to be a little higher, then you can separate it at surface. And instead of putting it into natural gas pipelines, you can produce pure hydrogen. And there's a process called pressure swing absorption that this PSA that I talked about here. It's used in refineries right now, but it's a way to purify hydrogen. So you can use pressure swing absorption at surface to separate any remaining natural gas in the reservoir from hydrogen. And then you have a pure source of hydrogen that you can deliver to customers, and that's a very valuable thing. There's a large market for hydrogen all over the world, and increasingly people want to have green hydrogen. I think I'll go through this fairly quickly, but these are the steps I discussed: grid integrated electrolysis, underground storage, mixing underground of natural gas and hydrogen, and then purification using pressure swing absorption. So this can be done on a very large scale. Again, I won't get into a lot of detail on this, but I did want to show an example. This is a company in Austria that's an operator of very large natural gas storage systems, RAG. And this is a presentation they made, so obviously I'm taking this from them. So using depleted gas reservoirs that they operate in Austria, the same thing that I'm talking about. This is an example of pretty much exactly what I'm describing for Ontario that they're already doing in Austria. So electrolytic, power to hydrogen, and then creation of hydrogen-enriched natural gas and ultimately pure hydrogen. This is their presentation, but it's we found it almost a perfect example of what we'd like to do here. So as far as I know, this is the only project in the world like what I'm talking about, but it kind of demonstrates that these things can be done. So this is their view of how this would work. It's basically exactly what I described in terms of electrolysis, underground storage, and a depleted natural gas reservoir. Production of, this is in German, but, it's sort of gas in electrolysis, storage and hydrogen enriched natural gas going out. They're talking about H2 selective membranes, which is basically pressure swing absorption. So they're collecting data, and this is a very professional demonstration project. And I guess one thing that can come out of this is, and this is kind of out there a little bit, but directionally probably where the world's going. I talked about hydrogen economy, growing use of hydrogen. What they found is that when you inject hydrogen into a natural gas reservoir, there's naturally occurring CO2. Most natural gas reservoirs have some component of CO2. But if you combine CO2 and hydrogen under the right temperature and pressure regime, you can create what's called SNG, or synthetic natural gas. And so you're producing a form of natural gas using CO2, naturally occurring CO2 and hydrogen. What makes this significant is there's a lot of effort, especially in Western Canada, being spent on carbon capture and sequestration. So if you have large volumes of CO2, which they're doing right now, capturing it and injecting it underground, and so if you, and this is pretty conceptual, but this is the direction the world's going, is if you take renewable hydrogen and inject it into a CO2 reservoir to produce synthetic natural gas, and then you produce the synthetic natural gas and burn it, and then capture the carbon, sequester it, it's a zero carbon form of energy. In other words, you're recycling the carbon. You do carbon capture, you sequester it, you inject hydrogen, from renewable sources, then you produce synthetic natural gas underground, burn it. So out there is this loop of carbon capture and a zero carbon loop. I thought that was quite interesting that they were talking about that in this Austrian project, that they weren't really looking for that, but they did notice a component of synthetic natural gas being produced in these reservoirs. I thought that was kind of cool. So surplus power can be stored underground, and it could be compressed air, it could be hydrogen, or a hydrogen and natural gas mixture. And we talked about the progression of these, how you can go from hydrogen-rich natural gas to really your ultimate goal is just pure hydrogen. We operate depleted, substantially depleted pinnacle reefs in Huron County. We're not the only ones. There are other pinnacle reefs that could be developed for storage of hydrogen or potentially natural gas. This would be subject to some pilot testing, and obviously new regs will be required. What's interesting is that this area is, as I said, very thin natural gas grid, very strong electric power grid. So how can we, as a producer, interface with the power grid more so than the natural gas grid? In this case, compressed air energy storage makes the most sense where there isn't a local outlet for hydrogen. So what I would suggest is that the areas that are close to Sarnia, close to refineries, close to places where they use a lot of hydrogen, you're probably better off storing hydrogen underground and trying to come up with this pure hydrogen source that I described using underground storage. But I think where there's no local market for hydrogen and the economic support are round trip, so producing electrolytic hydrogen is not a round trip. You're never putting that power back on the grid. Compressed air, it is a round trip, it goes back on the grid. If there's no local market for hydrogen, and I suggest that is the case in Huron County, where you're not that close to Sarnia. So in those cases, I think compressed air energy storage probably does make more sense. Being a natural gas producer, our interest in that would certainly be using our reservoirs, which are very large pinnacle reefs, to store compressed air. We think there is a way to store compressed air in depleted natural gas reservoirs. It needs some new regs, it needs some new testing, but we think that that's a direction we should be looking at. So as I mentioned, hydrogen probably makes more sense. Underground storage of hydrogen in areas close to Sarnia refineries. We think that we can use hydrogen enriched natural gas as an outlet for hydrogen in the local area where we operate with new pipeline developments. It's relatively small scale, Kincardine an area, new pipeline developments. We think that is an outlet for hydrogen in an area where there are no refineries. But as I said, in this particular area where you're probably more likely doing a round trip than having a local market for hydrogen, then compressed air energy storage is probably the best bet in that area. Thanks very much.